Towards his own.
For my living, when I work. There you go. When I work for money.
All right, so it's 6:01, guys. I think we can come to order. We've got the, looks like we've got Zoom going.
There you go.
And we are here at the town hall. Welcome to the August 15, 2022 meeting of the Town of Reedfield Board of Appeals. We are working from a prepared agenda tonight. Looks like we're going to look at trying to approve the minutes from the last meeting. And then we've got to go to the election of the officers for the Board of Appeals. And then we're going to be addressing the appellate appeal of the Marashes on the denial of the planning board, their May 24th, 2022 decision. So that's the order of matters for tonight. Let's see, present here are all 6 members of the Board of Appeals. We also have the code enforcement officer. We have the 2 appellants, the Marashes. We have Kristen Parks, the clerk. I'm getting that right, clerk. And then if I could have you guys in the audience go around and introduce yourselves. Just give us your name.
Sure, my name is Keith Meyer. We live at 14 Prosperity Lane.
Okay,
And I'm Janet Meyer. We're 2 doors south of the Marashes.
great.
Eric Falconer, 152 Thorpe Shores Road. I live on the lake as well.
Carolyn Palmer, 36 Wooden Drive.
And David.
Okay. Great.
Tom Mulroky, I live at 146 Thorpe Shores Road in Reedfield, and I'm a friend and neighbor of them.
Great. Looks like we also have by Zoom, Jack Comart, Paula Clark from the planning board. We have Rob Schumacher and local resident. So, Board of Appeals members, are we all familiar with the draft version of the minutes from the last meeting?
Is that the February 17th, 2022 meeting?
Yes, perhaps our quickest meeting ever. And any motion on adopting those?
I'd like to move we adopt those minutes as submitted.
Seconded?
I would second.
All right. All right, a vote on it. All in favor, raise your hand. And,
I wasn't at the meeting,
okay,
so
you're abstaining.
I'm abstaining.
Okay. And Holly, how did you vote?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So we have,
No, I guess I was there.
I was there, so I vote yes.
okay,
I thought I missed that.
so we have,
It's a
a-
sign that you did.
okay, so we have a unanimous vote to adopt the minutes from the last meeting. Moving on to the next item, which is the election of officers, which is generally just a chance for current officers to get out if they want to. Me, I feel like I've been here too shortly in my current position, so I'm not gonna ask that you guys remove me. But anybody have any thoughts or concerns on on officers who wants to be one?
I think it's a good lineup of professionals that can help us navigate the complexities properly. So
So it's
Well,
Bill,
they
Peter,
would-
and Holly, who are chair, vice chair, and secretary.
I would move that we ask them for their continued participation.
I'd second that.
Okay. All in favor of that motion, raise your hand. All right, looks like it's unanimous again. 6-0. Okay, so now we're moving on to kind of the meat of the meeting here, which is the appellate review of the planning board's decision. So the issue tonight is pretty simple. It's whether the planning board made an error when it made its findings of fact and conclusions of law in this May 24th decision. We'll do the hearing with the Marashes giving their argument first, followed by abutters, if they so desire. And then the planning board, I think they want to make a an argument, a presentation, and then anybody else, if you're dying to give us argument, you can. After each person gives their argument, planning board members, we can ask some questions. And then we'll move on with each person who's presenting an argument. So the burden of proof here today is on the appellants. We cannot receive any new factual evidence here today. So we're limited solely to the record from the May 24th decision, which was created in this case by our ordinance by the code enforcement officer. So we have sent out these documents. They essentially are the application for the appeal. There's a couple of maps showing the lots with the current structure and the proposed structure. And then there's the meeting minutes from the planning board that we sent out. We will also include I think that's it for the record. So that's the record we've got, that we can't get any more evidence than what's there.
Now, we've received some written argument already, though. It
Yes.
becomes part of our record, which is a thumb drive from the appellants, which we have read, plugged it in. I think we've all read it. And in addition, we've received a submission from the planning board vice chair, a written submission.
And so we're receiving argument today. So the documents we're getting that are coming in, we can consider them insofar as they are argument. Insofar as they are facts that were not before the planning board on or before when they made the decision, we just can't consider them. So again, this is not a de novo or a new hearing. We're not getting a second bite at the apple here. We're just seeing that the planning board made an error when it did its findings of fact and its legal conclusions back in May of this year. So with that in mind, since we're just getting argument tonight, we're not getting any new facts. There's a possibility that if you get up and you start to speak and you are presenting new facts, I will have to shut you down because we just can't consider it. So I'm not doing that because I'm mean or I don't like you. It's just, that's how we have to run these hearings. That's what our ordinance requires. Okay. Board members, any questions or concerns before we jump into argument? Just double checking, do we have the Hueys here today?
No. They're on Zoom.
All right. Dave Huey. Dave Huey, are you on the Zoom hearing?
Yes,
Yes, we are here.
Are you a butters of 111 Mail Road?
Yes,
And did you get notice in the mail 10 days prior to hearing about today's hearing?
no,
Are you okay going forward with today's hearing, even though you didn't get that notice 10 days in advance?
yes,
Thank you. So we also have, we received an email from Rob and Kathy Corey, who are also abutters, and they indicated their support of the Marashes as well. And we understand that they are fine going forward with tonight's meeting, even though they didn't get their fancy envelope in the mail 10 days in advance. So, board members, are we okay with the notice that was provided for today's hearing?
well, that was my question. I did hear from our code enforcement officer that we weren't sure whether the meeting was properly noticed. If abutters who would be the recipient of those notices waive their concerns, are we then fully, legal and upright in our ability to conduct the appeal?
What do you, Peter, what do you think?
Well, Mr. and Mrs. Marash, do you have any problem with going forward tonight? Or based on, there was this failure to notify butters in the way they should have been notified. I guess they did get notice, but not in the manner they should have.
I
Is that a
have,
problem?
no, it's not a problem. You've heard from the Hueys, they're fine with it, and the Corys, I believe, sent a letter of support, and they're okay with it as well.
The other people, I think, who should have received that notice in the prescribed manner were the members of the planning board. And I don't know if any of, and if any of them object to going forward tonight. But they all got notice of but they didn't get notice in the way they should have.
Paula, are you okay with going ahead without your proper notice?
Yes, the planning board's okay with that. We don't object.
Just for the record, do we know why the notice was improperly sent or received? Was it a deal about registered mail or?
We had an issue getting it out on time and an issue with the newspaper that published it. So
Okay.
it's probably-
And there's definitely an issue with the new chair.
Hopefully there's a to be improved function that can happen. All right.
Mr. Marash, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I was just wondering how many people were representing the planning board.
How many, Paula and Jack, are both of you speaking tonight?
Likely, and it is just the two of us representing the planning board tonight.
Any other questions, Mr. Marash?
No.
Anything else before we get going with argument? All right, so, Mr. and Mrs. Marash, go ahead with your argument.
Okay. Thank you all for your time, reviewing the documents, and giving us allowance to discuss this tonight. As you know, relief is being requested for the denial of the proposed plans submitted to the planning board for relocating a home 75 feet back from the high water mark. The board's stated reason being the structure was too large and too close to the water line, despite allowances in the land use ordinance of the permit a reduction in waterfront setback if the setback has been met to the greatest practical extent. The goal of the greatest practical extent requirement is to protect the lake and provide the most beneficial outcome for the health of the lake when all factors are considered. We submit to you unique circumstances of this property with its steep slope and dense forest tree growth. That was shown in Appendix B. The board's denial on May 24th was primarily based on assertion of the board that the structure was, in their opinion, too large, and because of that proposal did not meet the greatest practical extent. However, when making the assertion, the board repeatedly described the proposed home as being 4,600 square feet in the floor area. The description was used by the board to compare the existing 2,100 square feet of structure to the proposed statement that we were not entitled to our expansion of our current structure under the land use ordinance greatest practical extent. The problem with the board's assertion, however, is that 4,600 square feet includes a proposed deck, garage, and basement foundation. The primary livable space of the proposed structure is 2,642 square feet. This floor area represents a modest and reasonable expansion of the existing floor structure area to accommodate the family's needs as we age and will likely require aids for walking, wheelchairs, and moving between floors and elevator. This modest expansion of the existing floor area has been granted under nearly identical conditions as we will explore below. Background of the proposed home floor area. The primary living area will be 2,642 square feet. There is a basement foundation, including a garage, which is aligned below the living floor, having an identical square footprint. A 300 square foot deck is at the level of the primary living floor. the sum of all floor area located less than 100 feet from the high water mark is less than the 1,500 square feet. And also no structure is inside of the 75 feet.
So Mr. Marash, if I can just jump in, it seems like you're mostly reading from your argument that you provided on your.
Yes,
And we've read that, assume we know that. And now,
Okay.
I'm not gonna tell you how to make your argument, but if you want to jump to your meat, assume we know your written document, we've gotten that on the
Okay.
thumb drive.
and everybody's read it. Building permits issued by the town of Reedfield have historically not been consistent concerning whether basement foundation, garages, and decks are to be included as part of the structure. The permit application was submitted and accepted as complete under the 2020 land use ordinance. Numerous buildings permits subject to the revision of the land use ordinance, previous revisions or applicable sections remain unchanged. Can we move to my presentation that I submitted and go to page 46 for bill comparison?
On what property?
On my property?
You're comparing your property to another property?
Yes.
Which one?
I want to look at the Smart property and the Les Priest property.
I don't see those as being in the record for today's hearing.
They were on the thumb drive. They were PowerPoint presentations.
Yes.
Right, so that is argument. The
Okay.
thumb drive was submitted by the applicants, the appellants. That's argument. Insofar as we're considering, it. If it's new evidence,
You can't.
then we can.
This was discussed at the meeting and the previous meetings to that.
I don't, that may very well be, but it's not in the record that we have for today's hearing, which are just the minutes of the prior meetings, a couple maps and your
Well,
application.
if the meeting notes are deficient, that they didn't record that, how should that impact us?
That you cannot discuss that at today's hearing. So as you can see, our scope is super limited today because
Yes,
our written
yes, I do
record is
see that.
very small.
I discussed the Smart property. Cliff, or Chip, do you remember discussing the Smart property at the last meeting? Let me ask one of the planning board members, do you remember me discussing the Smart property in our meeting?
Oh, there's.
Paula, you want to answer that?
Yes. Mr. Morash raised the issue of the Smart property, but we did not have any in-depth discussion about the circumstances with respect to the Smart property or the decision that was rendered. So
Did you get into like square footages and how close it was to boundaries
water?
and stuff?
we did not talk about the details of it as a planning board. Mr. Morash did raise the subject, but we did not get into specific discussion about the square footages and so forth.
Paula,
Jack, I don't know if you have other recollections about that, but that's mine.
We specifically said we weren't going to go down that road. We weren't going to start comparing, what happened in cases from 2, 3, 4 years ago.
I remember stating that their property was built, its original property was at 60 feet and they built at 90. And that was approved. I remember saying that to you. Whether it made the record or not is,
Go ahead.
There was a PDF of a spreadsheet that was submitted in the thumb drive, which again, I believe is stuff that was compiled by the Morashes for
Correct.
our information background
It's argument.
argument. And there's that summary spreadsheet that was in PDF format.
Right.
That I've got in front of me here. I think maybe that's what you were referring to.
yes, yeah. But I did not have that spreadsheet, but we discussed it verbally in some other properties. And
this spreadsheet that's here that is a comparison of these other properties is on information that we're able to discern today. Is that correct?
Correct.
Because it's not part of
Correct.
what they had reviewed
It's not part of the record that was provided to us by the code enforcement officer.
or by the previous planning board decision.
Right, that would be an underlying document. Theoretically, we can consider only the documents, well, not theoretically, according to our ordinance, we can only consider the documents that were provided to us by the code enforcement officer as part of the record. So Mr. Marash, these
So
documents,
if you're going to go there, if it's part of the record, there are no meeting notes for multiple of our meetings that we had. And that is on no fault of ours. That's the town of Greenfield that neglected to record those and document them. So that becomes that's, we don't have any recourse because the town failed there.
that's how our ordinances are currently drafted.
They should record the planning board meetings. Did they?
Some of them are not.
We have meeting minutes. So Mr. Marash, almost everything on your zip drive, we cannot consider as far as documents go. Because they were not presented to the planning board.
Verbally, they were, and that's where,
And that would definitely be, so if you verbally talked about it, but you have
Yes.
documents now, absolutely, none of
Yes.
those documents can come into today's hearing.
What's that?
We cannot consider any documents that were not before the planning board. Even though you may have talked about it in generalities or very specifics, if you've got documents here today on your zip drive,
Yeah,
we cannot consider them.
okay. Thank you. The board has not historically required applicants to replace an existing structure with one of equal or lesser size. The board arbitrarily decided to apply this to the proposal. Despite the clear limitations of the lot, such as the size of the lot, the slope of the lot, and the location of the developed forest and potential for soil erosion, the board gave little consideration to these factors. The size of the lot is 0.61 acres, which makes meeting all setbacks a challenge at best. From 0 to 100 feet from the high water mark, there is little to no canopy of trees existing. The natural slope of the land is approximately 5%, 0 to 100 feet. Beyond 100 feet in the high water mark, the land becomes much more wooded and the land slope goes to 17% at its worst case, which makes it a challenge. In February of 2022, the town manager and the CEO declined to travel down the hill to assess the property during a site visit due to the slope and their concern of not being able to safely travel the hill, down the hill and get back up. The DEP in 2020 performed a site visit. In their field determination form, it is recommended that the disturbance of the steep slope and existing vegetation is avoided to the greatest extent practical during construction. That's word from the main DEP. Arguments such as in previous structures, the house could not be moved back and still maneuver a vehicle into the garage. In addition, the topography is much steeper, has been accepted and permitted by the town. I've got to go through and call out some of the stuff I've had because, of the limitations now presented. existing structures such as mine, that now the town planning board has discussed as 4,600 square feet have not been discussed that way in previous permits and or discussions in the town, if you look through the notes. And full basements have been allowed. In some instances in permits, if permits are reviewed, no first floor size has been listed on a recent permit under the 2020 ordinance, which we are submitted and approved under for a full permit. As explained throughout the letter, we strongly contest the validity of the board's denial of the permit application. The board's argument that the ordinance does not permit an expansion of the structure is a selective interpretation that only appears to have been applied to our proposal. The board has repeatedly permitted expansions of very similar nature in a recent history under the same land use ordinance. The board also misleadingly labeled the proposed structure to be 4,600 square feet, when previous applications and permits in the town records do not ancillary portions of a building, such as garage and basement foundation area of the home. The board's argument that the existence of an additional theoretical building structure beyond 100 feet from high water precludes the use of the greatest practical extent is disingenuous reading of the ordinance that is unlikely to have been applied to another application in recent history. To completely disregard the challenges of the specific site in the hill, the trees, and the slope of it, and the relative benefits to the lake of not forcing the structure further from the water is to disregard the intent of the land use ordinance provision, which are intended to protect bodies of the water, wildlife, nature, and the residents of Reedfield who have the privilege to enjoy those. The board has repeatedly stated that they are, to paraphrase, just following the ordinance. We disagree by applying an excessive, strict interpretation of the land use ordinance while simultaneously ignoring the clear intent of the greatest practical extent exception and placing arbitrary limitations on its use, although granting it in other instances. We believe the town of Reedfield Planning Board was arbitrary and capricious in its decision to deny our permit application. Just a little history on us. We have been in Reedfield for 23 years, coming up in 2-3 weeks time. We raised our kids here. We've been here. Our kids were raised here during the summer. I snowmobile and fish here all the time. I've been on the emergency watershed, milfoil examinations, dam chairman, trying to fix the dam that was put in incorrectly. After 2.5 years of going through this with the town, it's been a very trying time for my wife, myself, and my family, and really, trying to just bring our dreams to fruition without having a structure in a house that is treacherous during the winter and is incredibly difficult to get into such that we can enjoy it as our retirement home. We hope the appeals board of Reedfield can exercise what we believe to be good judgment and reason to come to the same conclusion that we do. That conclusion is that the proposal is better for the lake. It is better than what exists today and is better than any other potential viable alternatives. It is also in compliance with the town of Reedfield land use ordinance, and therefore a building permit should be issued based on the proposal previously denied by the planning board. Thank you very much, Scott and Don.
Thank you. So
Sorry, I
board,
couldn't have lived that.
no, that's absolutely fine. Board of Appeal members, any questions for Mr. and Mrs. Moran?
I'd have a couple, but I think I was gonna try to wait till we hear the whatever presentation made by the planning board, and then
Yeah, then we can circle back.
might save time.
Okay.
More.
We can do that too. Anybody
But
else
if
have?
anyone wants to ask right now, you can.
Absolutely.
Well, I will just make an observation about what I'm hearing and thinking. And it's difficult to distinguish for me what's on the written record, having not been at the planning board hearings. I've consumed all the information that has been presented here. I've read the memo from the planning board to the Board of Appeals. But it's very difficult for me to distinguish what is appellate and what might be considered de novo, if those are the terms of art to use.
Yeah.
And I know we can't introduce anything that is new information here. And then there's another thought that's cascading through my head, which is why can't, for 2.5 years of planning board discussion, it be a more collaborative process? And why cannot, and I'm not pointing fingers at the planning board, I'm asking sort of a rhetorical question here. Why can't there be more collaboration in how these things get done and considered, so that you don't find you've not provided the right information, so you haven't provided it, but that you go in and you work sort of collaboratively with whomever. And I suspect there's been CEO, although I know we've had a lot of turnover.
We've had four CEOs, and I've lived on the lake we've lived on the lake 23 years, and we've seen the improvement of other structures on the body of water. And I've read the land use ordinances, and after visiting my buddy Dave Palmer in Maryland and spent lots of wonderful times there, they had a place that was 50 feet in the water, they built it at 75. So you say to yourself, well, when did they do that? That's 2007, 2008. Okay, then you can look at other properties on the lake that are just like that. And we said, you know what? There's room for exactly what we want to do. And then you see a structure that's 2 years submitted at the same time our submission was in there, and that was approved to build at 90 feet, and 1 year previous to build at 80 feet. And you say to yourself, okay, we're moving forward with this. At no time did the any of the members say, well, if you went to this, we would work with you and allow you to build the structure. What we've heard is, no, we don't, we think your structure is too big. And nowhere in the land use ordinance in the town of Reedfield does it state what the size of the structure should be. In my mind, no, nor should it. What it does state is you have the a certain impervious soil calculation. If you don't violate that, you can build a structure. And then there's the land use ordinance, which we went through and had stopped a meeting and said, oh, you need to go address all the little instances in the land use ordinance. And each one, the slope of the hill, the forestation of it, and we addressed every one of those. And looking at our plot and the land that is, no trees have to be removed at all, and we're not building into the slope, one would say that makes sense. And then maybe lastly, just thinking about how are those people gonna be able to get into their place on a January, afternoon that it's, 0 degrees and they've got to go halfway up the hill to approach to the garage. And that's where we're being pushed right now, where you can look at other permits in this town that they have said, oh, well, they would have to move up the hill and there's trees back there, so we're gonna let them build right there. And we said to ourselves, you know what? We should be in the same standard, unified and non-arbitrary ability to build just like those were granted, and thought, you know what? They'll come around, and each time we went back and gave them the information they requested, and then that goalpost gets moved, and then there's something else. Oh, the tree reforestation plan. Okay, we got one of those now, and then it just kept moving, and unfortunately, it's. After 2.5 years, really, it's just.
Okay,
Would you
board
like to-
members, any other questions?
Well,
I have some
Look-
questions, but maybe you want to hear the planning board
Yeah, we can do that too.
first.
let me just make one observation, Mr. Marsh. It's not that we're not, if there was an inconsistency in terms of who got a permit in the past, we on the appeals board would have no way of knowing that, whether it was a legal problem, because no one appealed those. In other words, if a permit's granted, it's in theory, and a butter can appeal that, or someone else who's aggrieved by that permit could appeal it. They didn't. So we don't know. We don't know if the planning board misinterpreted the land use ordinance when they granted those other permits. It's just, you're free to argue that, but we don't know. And again, we're constrained by our limited jurisdiction. So that's just my observation about the other properties. And I'd save my other questions for later.
Sure. Board members, anybody else have a question or comment at this point? All right. Abutters, it's your turn to present arguments. The Corys are not here. Huey's, you're on Zoom?
Did you get a chance to read their letter?
Yes, and that'll be part of the record from the Corys, Rob and Kathy.
Yes.
That'll be part of the record. For the Hueys on Zoom, do you guys have any argument that you'd like to present at this time?
Well, we certainly are not against.
Mr. Huey, you are on a bad, we have a bad Zoom connection with you. You've already killed your video. Sometimes that helps.
They're good friends, and we own almost all the property around them and almost all the way halfway up the road for about a half a mile. And as major abutter of most of the people that use the W6 road, Mayo Road, we're good friends with all of these folks. And I don't know, it's just, I don't know why
Mr. Huey, let me interrupt you there.
the opposition to Scott's
Mr.
proposal.
Huey, hang on just a second. Can you hear me, Mr. Huey?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I'm just interrupting you briefly. So for the Hueys and anyone else who wishes to testify here today, I'm going to shut you down pretty quick when you get up and say, I think this is a great project, or I think it's a terrible project. You need to be a little more specific than that. We need to see what finding of fact the planning board made that was incorrect, or what conclusion was incorrect. I've given great latitude to the applicants, of course, as it's their application, but for the remainder of people presenting argument, as much, I think we all agree the applicants are great people, that they're gonna build a great house. on this property at some point. But it's not whether we wish this house could get built or not. So that's an argument that I'm not accepting here today. So with that in mind, Mr. Huey, do you have
Well, then
anything
what is there?
specifically regarding the planning board's decision on their findings of fact or conclusions of law that you disagree with?
I disagree with a lot of what they went over.
So looking at the planning board decision from May, tell me what you disagree with.
I disagree with the fact that they said the house was too large.
Where in the written decision did they say that?
I don't see it. I don't have those papers here.
Does anybody see that in the written decision that it says the house is too large?
Well, I can tell you.
Hang on, this is for the board members.
I think what, again, we can ask the planning board, the way I read their decision, they're saying that the practical extent, because the entire current house could be placed more than 100 feet from the high water mark of the lake, that to put any part of the replacement house less than 100 feet away was a problem under the ordinance. So they also went on, the decision seems to say that the Marashes, of course, not only could, the decision claims that the Marashes could have built a larger house than the current house, as long as it was outside the 100-foot zone from a high water mark. And that this particular house, which it's partly within 100 feet from the, that because it's partly within 100 feet from the high water mark, they're saying doesn't meet the ordinance to the greatest practical extent. That's how I interpret the decision. But I could be, other people could interpret it differently.
So, Mr. Huey, back to you. Do you have any additional argument you'd like to offer? As an abutter?
No, I guess not.
Okay, thanks. Board members, any questions for Mr. Huey? Okay. So why don't we go to the planning board next? So Paula, would you like to present any statement from the planning board?
Yes, thank you. I do have a few points that I'd like to make. I know most of you, but for those that I might not know, I'm Paula Clark. I chair the planning board, and also here tonight is Jack Comart, who is the vice chair of the planning board. And we thank you for the opportunity to participate and address you tonight. I don't want to go through the entire case and repeat all of the facts and the information that you received in advance. But what I would like to do briefly is twofold. First, I wanted to highlight the memo that was sent to you yesterday by Jack and I concerning the state mandatory shoreline zoning guidelines. And secondly, I'd like to identify and comment on a few of the points that we feel are particularly important related to the planning board's deliberation and decision on this matter. First of all, I would point out that when you look to the ordinance, this type of a proposal would be looked at in two pieces. The ordinance, first of all, calls for, there is a standard for the replacement of a structure that is non-conforming. And it says that a non-conforming structure may be replaced or reconstructed, provided that all of the standards of the land use ordinance are met to the greatest practical extent. So that's where that discussion comes from, the requirement that if you have a non-conforming structure and you want to move it or you want to replace it, reconstruct it, it must meet the standards to the greatest practical extent. The second piece is separate from that greatest practical extent standard, and it has to do with the circumstances under which a non-conforming structure can be expanded. And so the ordinance runs through those circumstances specifically, and that gets us to the discussion of the 1,500 square feet and so forth that has come up previously. I would say that it's important to note in all of this that the law, and by extension, any ordinances or rules that are based on the law do not favor nonconformity. And the ordinance itself and in individual decisions, there is an effort made to eliminate nonconformity or to minimize nonconformity to the extent possible. You've heard that the application was considered under the previous ordinance that was in effect when the Morashes originally submitted their application. In 2021, the language concerning expansion of non-conforming structures was revised. And so the language from the 2020 ordinance has been revised. That was revised in 2021. And what we felt was that, historically, that old language was somewhat unclear. People had varying interpretations of how it should be applied. And there were a lot of discussions and debates about that. The 2021 revisions clarified that expansion of a structure, any portion of which is located less than 100 feet, would not cause the total floor area of the structure to exceed 1,500 square feet. So that's where the 1,500 comes in. The new ordinance states that very clearly. The previous ordinance was not as clear, and it caused confusion, and it caused a lot of discussions and debates, as I mentioned previously, about the correct interpretation and how that should be applied. I would say that although the language of that previous ordinance was not as clear as it could or should have been, it simply is not reasonable to draw the conclusion that the ordinance in 2020 provided a right to build an additional 1,500 square feet of structure in the 75 to 100 foot zone. The general setback standard in the ordinance is 100 feet. It is not 75. I think that an ongoing concern with this proposal from the very beginning was that it appeared to attempt to maximize the square footage in the 75 to 100 foot zone. And again, the actual standard is 100 feet, not 75 feet. I would add in response to Henry's comment about collaboration and the amount of time that this application took, that issue had been raised repeatedly in planning board meetings. And in fact, the planning board had asked at one point early on that the Morashes go back and reassess their proposal because the planning board was concerned that it did not conform to the standards in the LUO. We asked them to consider a revised proposal that would conform, and many months passed before we had any communication about this application. And the first thing we heard was that it was coming to the appeals board. And so many months passed with no planning board activity and no further discussion. So it simply was not a matter of the planning board taking 2.5 years to move this through the process. There were many meetings, many conversations. That certainly is true. But there were also many months when we simply were not communicating with the applicant and vice versa.
Thank you, Paul.
I have a couple more points. I'll wrap up here quickly. I would just like to mention generally the memo that was received from Jack and I about the mandatory shoreline zoning ordinance. And I think what's important to say about that memo, I'm not going to go through the content of it, obviously, but there is a footnote on the first page that makes it clear that the planning board typically does not cite state laws and regulations in its decisions. But in this particular case, we thought that it would be helpful and informative strictly to provide some additional context with regard to interpretation, to appropriate interpretation of the LUO based on the state's interpretation of the mandatory shoreline zoning guidelines. So it is there for context. It was not cited directly in the decision. One final point, and this is in response to a couple of the comments that I heard earlier. I would point out that there is a specific definition of floor area in the ordinance, and it includes basements, decks, and so forth. So that is not a case-by-case decision. It is a formal definition that specifically includes those aspects of a house. Finally, the planning board, as was mentioned earlier, the subject of other decisions that the planning board rendered at various points in the past was raised by Mr. Morash. We did not get into any details of those past situations. And in our consultations with the town attorney, I mean, she certainly made it clear that any past decision, regardless of whether it was consistent with this proposal or not, was not precedential, that no one is bound by decisions that were made in past decisions. I don't personally, I haven't looked at all of those. I don't know what those cases are, and the planning board hasn't analyzed those in any way. But in any event, we've been advised that they do not set precedent. And with that, thank you again for the opportunity to address you. And Jack and I are both here and happy to try to respond to any questions that you might have of us.
That would be Board of Appeals members. Peter, you have some questions.
I do. Paula, if in fact the memo we received the other day is controlling, why wasn't that the major point of the decision? If state law, this is a state rule that says if the total footprint of the original structure can be relocated or reconstructed beyond the required setback area, no portion of the relocated or reconstructed structure shall be replaced or constructed at less than the setback requirement for a new structure. Why wasn't that the point of the decision? I'm confused.
Well, and as you know, this went on it was a process. It went on for many months. We were originally presented with this proposal to demolish the existing structure and to build a larger structure beginning at about 75 feet from the high water mark. It quite honestly took a while for the planning board to work through the proposal, understand specifically what was being asked. and to understand that, from the applicant's perspective, that there really was no, flexibility in their mind about what they, their proposal in terms of what they wished for and what they needed. I don't think that, in retrospect, perhaps it would have been better to simply deny it on that basis and state very, very clearly and simply that that it could not be approved for that reason. But I think that perhaps overly optimistically, I think that we held out some hope that we would be able to work with the applicant to discuss this as a planning board and perhaps come out the other end with a proposal that was conforming to the LUO, rather than brush it off and simply make a declaration about how it did not fit that initial replacement aspect. We had.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just going to say that we did have, as I mentioned before, several conversations with the applicant and requested that they look at revising their proposal to see if there was an approach that would be in conformance with the LUO. And we had also specifically talked about the fact that the language of the new ordinance offering more flexibility in terms of what they could do, and that it was very likely that under the new ordinance language, they would be able to not only reconstruct the 2,100 square foot structure, but expand it significantly. I mean, to a significant extent within the 100-foot boundary. Now, we didn't look at any specific.
I'm sorry, I just need to make sure I understand. Are you saying that the planning board's position is that in fact, a larger house could be built in conformity with the ordinance, but it would have to be at least 100 feet from the high water line? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Peter, are you have any more?
I do, but you can go. I've been hogging the time.
Well, I have a question perhaps for Paula or for the Board of Appeals group about it seems very subjective to me, the phrase greatest practical extent. And what is the greatest practical extent? And when is a proposal that leads to from between 100 feet and 75 feet in the setback zone, when is it impractical to expect that you remain in compliance with the LUO, but it's impractical to move the house, to pass that 100-foot mark? And so it seems to me that there's some subjectivity in that phrase, and it's in the footnote of the memo, Paula and Jack, from the planning board to the zoning board of appeals. It's footnote number 2. Any such determination would depend on the applicant meeting the greatest practical extent test, and then only when the determination has been made that reconstruction of the original size unit beyond the 100-foot mark is not possible. So we've got the word practical and the word possible in that same sentence, and that's difficult. Those clash in my head. What we're saying is you have to be beyond the 100-foot line. But then there's another part of the ordinance that says, or this footnote that says, to the greatest practical extent, you can only rebuild a structure if, to the greatest practical extent, you're able to stay in compliance with the land use ordinance. What am I missing here, Paula? Help me.
I would say again that it's important to think about this issue in two pieces. First, there are standards with regard to replacing an existing non-conforming structure. And the ordinance says that you can do that, but you must meet all standards of the LUO to the greatest practical extent. And the one that was prominent and controlling here was obviously the distance to the normal high water mark. And so what this requirement says is that you can replace your existing structure, which was 2,100 square feet, but you must meet that standard to the greatest extent practical. And so, you know, there have been situations where someone wanted to move or reconstruct a camp. And we look at things that are listed in the ordinance, factors that might be relevant to whether or not the greatest practical extent has been achieved. And they are such things as, you know, if you know, 50 feet behind your camp, you've got, you know, a huge a slope or a huge stand of old growth pine trees, you know, those kinds of issues, you know, the location of your septic system, that might be another factor. So all of those things might be relevant to the discussion about whether or not you've located it to achieve the setback to the greatest practical extent. In this particular case, the planning board made a finding that the 2,100 square foot structure could be relocated and reconstructed to meet the 100-foot setback. That was a finding that the planning board made. So separate and apart is the potential standards related to expansions of non-conforming structures. So that's the second piece of this.
Then ask a follow-up question for the Board of Appeals as well as perhaps Paula and Jack. So to the greatest practical extent, the newly proposed structure could be built within the 100-foot mark, could possibly be built. But to the greatest practical extent, at least from what I understand your letter to say, is that if you were to build the house within the 100 or past the 100-foot mark, it would, to a great extent, make your lives impractical because you wouldn't be able to march up the hill in the winter time, or you'd be hiking uphill to your garage, and it would be an impractical use of the property.
That's correct.
Which is where you think, to the greatest practical extent, you are eligible for some sort of an appeal, which is why we're all here,
Yes.
because it would make your use of the property that you intend to build impractical, because it would be sort of inconvenient. And so that's an interesting thought. Paula cited an old growth white pine stand. I'm a forester. I care about old growth white pine, but I also care about convenience as you get old and Daughtery and I'm 65 and you know, I'm not getting any.
I'm 62. At 72 years old, I'll probably be able to make that turn and get into that. Anyway, as I get older, I'm not going to be able to make that. And it's to a point where it is not going to be usable for us.
So to me, I think the discussion, and I think we're in bounds here, and help me if I'm wrong, Will, because I don't think we're doing anything de novo. I think we're doing appellate work here. I think we're kind of teasing out the difference between greatest practical extent and what that means for the LUO, which has been denied, this application has been denied against the LUO, and the greatest practical extent to which the Morashes can have their proposal be practical for their intended future use. And
Can I
then that
add
were
some-
possible, yeah, go ahead, please.
I mean, the greatest practical extent is defined in state law, state rules, and the LUO. And it doesn't include the convenience of the applicant. It deals with other factors. So we can't, that's not how we make our decisions. But I think what you need to
What's
look,
the definition, Jack? What's the
What?
definition? What's the definition?
I could read it from the LUO if you want.
It has a lot to do with vegetation and slope, which
It
is
has to
what
do
we
with the
highlighted in our.
It has to do with where the septic system is, where utility lines are, where the slope is, other natural features. But we didn't, when we asked whether the 2,100 square foot structure could be placed beyond the 100-foot line, whether there was any impediment to doing that, the answer was no, there's no impediment to doing that. Now, if they want to build something bigger than 2,100 square feet, let's say going back, they can build something that's much bigger than 2,100 square feet going back on their property. And at some point, for the Morashes, the slope is a concern for them. The planning board didn't find that the slope was a concern. That was a factual finding of the planning board. But that's for if they want to build a bigger house. They don't have to build a bigger house. What we looked at was the 2,100 square foot house, which is the reconstructed house, and it's what state law says. We look at the original structure, whether it can be relocated beyond the 100-foot line, which it can be. So that's sort of the end of the story. So then the Morashes can take their 2,100 square foot house, which is behind the 100-foot line, and build it bigger, much bigger. We repeatedly said you could build a much bigger house beyond the 100-foot line. And if you wanted to avail yourself of the new ordinance, you could make it even bigger, probably getting to 4,600 square foot or whatever they want. But they were insistent that the house be located between the 75 and 100-foot line. And they were insistent on that and would not compromise on that. And that's why we're here today.
Excuse me, we were not asked to compromise, thank you.
So, Mr. Morash, just in the future, you can respond to questions that are directly posed to you at this point in the hearing. But since you're not presenting an argument at this point, you wouldn't be allowed to jump in like that.
I'm sorry, I thought he was telling me what I said.
That's okay. No, he's testifying before the board members at this point.
All right.
And then do we go back to the applicant? to see
Yes,
if he has
yes,
a
you'll have,
response?
you will have a chance
Has a
for rebuttal.
response time.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Mr. Whittemore, any other questions?
I'm still not 100% comfortable with what I sense to be a disconnect between greatest practical extent, what that means for the LUO, and how that term of art is defined, and what it means for the applicant here.
Let me give my stab at it for you. So looking at the ordinance that the code enforcement officer sent us this afternoon, or just
I have it.
the one, so it's section 4
Okay.
of the land use ordinance,
Yep.
and then you go to
Subsection B2.
B2. And it lists out about 10 things. It's very specific, and it's saying these 10 things, like size of the lot, slope of the land, height of the building, potential for soil, it keeps going. Those are just some of them. It says among other factors. So it wants the planning board to consider a lot of it. And so I don't see it as like capricious or just at the whim of the planning board.
Oh, I'm not suggesting it is.
Okay.
What I am saying is, I'm not saying at the whim of anybody, that I have great respect for the planning board and I'm very appreciative of their service to the town. I do sense some subjectivity in the term to the greatest practical extent. And it seems to me that it's a bit squishy, and can cause
Well, our
conversations
ordinance,
like this.
our
that can be
ordinance
difficult.
specifically gave the planning board that discretion. It's how they decided. And, you know, it's a volunteer board, but these are our town professionals and they do it week in and week
I
out.
know.
And so we've got to trust them that they're looking at all these things. And we could ask them like, which of these factors did you guys consider when you thought, hey, we can put the original structure above the 100-foot line?
Well, once again, Will, and I'm not trying to be argumentative at all, but I am talking about ideas here. I'm not talking about de novo ideas.
Right.
Within sideboards. And some of this decision that came from the planning board was based on staying uphill of the 100-foot mark from the water.
Right.
And meeting this, what I think seems like some subjective language about the greatest practical extent.
I guess what's subjective is the applicants say, we can't move the house above, the current house above the 100-foot line. We just can't. It goes from 5 to 17 and it's just too steep. And the planning board looked at it and said, no, we think that slope is fine. And I think all of the appeal board members, we've been to the lot. We've seen that slope.
Yet there was a February field visit with the town manager and the CEO who chose not to walk down the slope in February because it was too icy on a 17% slope. Or judgment.
I'm not sure, yeah, we haven't heard testimony from them.
Well, could I make one other point, please, about this based on what I've just heard? And that is that, you know, the planning board's factual finding was that we believed that the existing structure could be replaced behind the 100-foot line. The applicant has argued, focused on the expanded structure that they're proposing, the 4,600 square foot structure. And that may be a different story. They may not find, and I think they have found, that it would be at least difficult for them to do that. But there is a difference between making that finding with regard to the existing 2,100 square foot structure and the larger proposed 4,600 square foot structure. The planning board did not make a factual finding on that expanded structure in that regard.
Paula, what were the factors that you guys considered most when making that decision that, hey, we can take the existing house and get it above the 100-foot line? Was it slope? Was it the septic system? What were those factors that made you guys think, oh, we can get it above the 100-foot line?
There was nothing that prohibited going above 100 feet with the 2,100 square foot house. The applicant didn't say there's a septic system there, there's a utility line there, there's a slope there. For a 2,100 square foot house, there's no impediment. As Paula just said, if you want to build a 4,600 square foot house, then you're getting into, you know, other issues such as slope of the land. But that's not before us, really. I mean, we determined that he has a right to reconstruct the 2,100 square foot house. And, you know, he could have argued, I can't put it back 100 feet because there's a septic system at 105 feet, or there's a utility pole there, or things like that. But he didn't argue that. There was no argument against citing a 2,100 square foot house beyond the 100-foot mark. It was citing a 4,600 square foot house that posed problems for Mr. Morash.
I can't talk now.
All right.
Well,
Board members, any other questions, comments? Go ahead, Cliff.
First, I'll comment about the document that came out yesterday. The question came up repeatedly years ago when I was taking shoreline zoning classes, question about enforcing the guidelines. And the answer to that is no, until they're adopted. They're only guidelines. So I don't think we can consider what was said on yesterday.
That
Because it was
highlighted
not-
language and
The
the state
highlighted
regulation.
language was not in the July 2020 ordinance.
Yep.
It's that simple.
Okay.
Leave it to the legal people to work that out. Just a couple of questions. Still.
So that's the portion of section 12.
It's got a-
Yeah,
Highlights.
chapter 1000.
it's got a rule number. It's an adopted state rule according to this submission. It's got a CMR number, which tells me that it's a duly adopted state rule.
It is.
It applies to us even though it's not in our land use ordinance?
I'm not, well, I think state law always applies if it's stricter than our ordinance. But, you know, shoreline zoning is very strict to begin with, and in theory, the state sets a minimum standard and municipalities can be stricter, but they can't be looser. Again, I'm not, beyond that, I'm not going to opine.
You know, again, that was provided to appeals board members, not because we're making an argument that it strictly applies to this case, because there are provisions in the minimum guidelines that are different from Reedfield's ordinance. But we thought that it provided valuable context with regard to interpreting what is in Reed Field's ordinance, particularly, with respect to, the question of where the 1,500 square feet comes in and so forth. So it was not with an eye toward applying it specifically and strictly. It does give you some context for how the state interprets that type of language and how the ordinance was intended, the purpose of the ordinance.
I'm sorry, Henry, you go.
No, I'm fine, thank
No,
you.
I was trying to ask a couple questions here. I just came out with that comment. Your design person is not here tonight,
No, it's not.
right? Okay. There's still no dimensions on your plans except for the non-conforming portion on drawing A10. There's references throughout the record that we have to 4,768 square feet, 4,600 square feet, 3,290. And on plan A02, that calculates out to 5,574. So I'm trying to, first of all, figure out how many square feet you propose at this time.
The first floor is,
I heard 4,600 more times than not here tonight.
yes, the first floor is not 4,600 square feet.
No, the total floor area,
Yes, that's what I believe it is, yes.
garage deck, everything.
Yes, yeah,
If I may, the spreadsheet shows 4,484.
okay.
Okay, and how many square feet do you propose in the non-conforming area?
It's under
Drawing.
1,500 square feet. I believe it's total is, yeah, it's exactly 1,500 square feet. That is the deck. And then a little bit of the actual first floor area. So some of the basement, yes.
Drawing A02 indicates 600. And A10 shows 1,431.
AO2. That's the square footage of the deck. And then if you go to A10, it adds up 556 and 875. And then you add the deck to that and it's 1,500.
That totals up to 1,431.
Okay, 1,431. It does not exceed the 1,500.
Second question is, what will be the total area of cleared opening for any purpose, including structures and land previously cleared? You may not know that.
The impervious soil calculation is, I
No.
believe, 15.9%.
No, the cleared opening area.
Well, that is increased by pushing the structure back from the 75 feet into the hill more. We have to take more trees.
I understand, right?
Yes,
But taking into account all the cleared openings after the completion of your project,
yes.
including land already cleared, what would be the total? Because there is a standard of 10,000 square feet. Cleared opening.
So 15.9% of 0.61 acres.
Yes.
Is,
No, you're talking about impervious area. I'm talking about cleared opening.
okay.
I'm not sure what the cleared opening is. Like I said, it's dramatically different if we don't have to push the structure back into the hill. Because there's trees back there.
It could be.
And the access that is already there to come into the camp can be used as well, rather than,
It could be that where you propose a house is slightly under 10,000. But where the planning board, if you make it fully conforming, you'd be over the 10,000. See what I mean?
Oh, yes, yeah. There's a possibility of that.
I think that's an important consideration, is how much cleared opening are you going to end up with?
But Cliff, our ordinance says that we cannot substitute our judgment for whatever factual finding was made by the planning board. I mean.
Right.
Well, the question.
So I would request that the planning board actually take a look at the,
So I'm gonna jump in. This is a good discussion and for definitely the house down the line,
yeah,
this cleared area. But we have 3 findings of fact in the decision that's before us. 3. The house is 2,100 square feet. The existing house is 14 feet away from the water. And you can push that up above the 100-foot line. Those are the 3 findings of fact. The bottom 2 are kind of
Yes,
these
that's-
hypothetical findings of fact.
right.
So,
those-
well, I get it, Cliff, that this is an important issue for this house, new house that's gonna get built at some point. It's really not for today's hearing, because we've got really 3 findings of fact that we're discussing here today.
In the validity of those findings of fact.
So
So,
it's a great issue for down the road. How much cleared area is gonna be on this lot, but it's really not before us. It's not in this decision here today.
I would request that maybe the appeals board review 814, which is the actual land use ordinance in each point of that. Because that's
So we're
very
not gonna
important.
consider this open area on the lot. That'll be for the planning board when you go back to the planning board.
Well,
Those are the only 2 questions I had as far as questions go.
Okay.
Paula, it seemed to me, going back through the minutes, starting in 2021, was it, or late 2020?
2020.
That the issue of we're talking not just about the size plus location of the proposal, was always an issue, right?
Yes.
It's always going to be an issue. What I don't understand, and I have a lot of sympathy for the applicants here, is why they got kicked over to us for a variance determination. I mean, other than the town attorney saying that, I didn't understand if the size and location of the house was always going to be a problem for the planning board, why the applicant was asked to apply for a variance to the appeals board.
The planning board,
Time.
the planning board didn't send,
I'm assuming good faith on the part of everybody, by the way. I don't think anyone was trying to delay it. But it had the effect of putting the applicant through unnecessary, in my view, extended unnecessarily lengthy procedures to get to this point.
the planning board didn't recommend that the applicant go to the appeals board. I understand that that happened, but we didn't tell them to do that. What we expected was that they were going to look at revising their proposal to conform to the LUO. And the next, our understanding was that they had decided to take it to the appeals board. We were waiting for them, as I mentioned before, for months to communicate with us about a revised proposal that didn't come.
Well, Paula, you recall that there was I was then chair of the appeals board, and there was a conference on Zoom involving the chairs of the planning board, the appeals board, and the town attorney. You do recall that?
Yes.
At which you recall that I kept saying that even though a variance request had been filed, that really the issue was the size and location of the house, and that had to be decided before there was any, because a variance decision wouldn't have resolved that either way.
Right, and there, as my recollection is that there was spirited debate among a number of parties about who was on first in that particular case. And I mean, it wasn't the planning board's decision to make. There had been a variance request filed, and I think the issue was to determine how that was going to be handled. And I certainly understand that different parties had different ideas about what was most appropriate in terms of which of those things needed to be resolved first. But the fact was that there was a variance request before the appeals board that needed to be handled in some fashion. And the collective decision, and it wasn't the planning board's decision, the collective decision was that the appeals board needed to hear that request and deal with it before we moved on. And I don't want to, to debate the pros and cons of, one coming before the other, but that is in fact how it shook out.
All right. Any other questions for the planning board? Anybody else would like to testify? Go ahead.
My name is Tom Maloki. I'm the town representative on the Cobussy Watershed District, the Cobussy Dam Committee, and I am a personal member of the Lake Association. Previously, I will just state, I testified what the morashes are asking for does improve the quality of the lake, does improve the environment that they're doing that. I would ask the board to take the same approach in your deliberations that the morashes did in the first 5 minutes of this presentation. Where did the board do and follow the letter of the law? Technically not. Nobody was informed in exactly the fashion that's laid out in the ordinance. And the morashes were asked, do you object that we go ahead? And they're willing to bend, not break, but bend. I would ask that you give these poor people a chance. 2.5 years is a hell of a long time. They're good people. They've asked for your response to have them bend the regulation that we're all tied to, and they're taking a practical approach. Let's move on with this. I would ask that you direct the enforcement people who do a great job of working out some kind of compromise so we can get this thing moved on. You don't have to give up your ordinance because you're proceeding with not following the letter of the law through some technicality of getting this moved on. Give these people a break. These are our neighbors and our friends. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Equal protection of the law requires that this greatest practical what be spread evenly among all applicants. I think what's happening here is that we're choosing who to be practical with and who to be possible with, and not paying attention to whether people are being equally treated.
Okay.
I'd like to say something.
Go ahead.
I'm Keith Meyer. I understand from what you said, Mr. Chair, that the question here is either legal or you can't do de novo and you can't do factual things, correct? I found interesting that Paula said the application was applied under the 2020 law, is that correct? And she said that she didn't like that law, the previous law, and when in 2020 it changed, the old law got clarified. And it was my understanding that the application that was made was under the old rule. And I'm not saying that it was bad, good, or indifferent, but to jettison by using the new standard when they were under the old, it seems to me raises a legal question. So that's my first point. The second point is I find it very interesting that she also said the attorney had advised her that the greatest practical extent possible, there's no precedential value. How do you begin to decide, for example, when someone said, according to what was put in your thumb drive, I guess, that somebody didn't like the garage, they didn't want to do that. That's in a sense kind of the issue that's raised here. I think those issues become relevant, even if they're not precedential. They give some suggestion as to the facts that have been used to decide that. So I think you can look at that. And the last thing is kind of interesting to me, the record. All of a sudden, we've got these issues as to what went on. And I don't know, is there a simultaneous recording? Are there minutes taken of these? Do the board themselves create the record that goes forward? Therefore, they have the ability to control what's in that record. To me, that raises an interesting question as to how you begin to assess what was and what was not considered. And you heard Paula and Scott talking about what was said, and they said no document. Well, I don't know. It seems to me we have, as a practical matter and common sense, when we know someone is similarly situated, you begin to think about whether those activities are the same or whether they're not. And I find it offensive, frankly, that they're saying none of these cases have any relevance because there was no documentation. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah, hello, my name is Tom Gottschalk. I'm a neighbor of the Rashes and the Myers, and based on the limitations of this hearing, I just want to say that for most of us, what matters the most is the protection of the lake and making sure that whenever there's an opportunity to improve the protection of the lake and the environment, it's in everybody's interest to do that. It is clear the Marashas do not want to build a house limited to the same size that their existing structure is, and they've explained why. They've explained why they want to build a bigger one and why it is practically impossible to do that entirely outside of the 100-foot zone, and why the exception they're seeking is reasonable and shows the practicality of the situation in terms of safety and other things. So echoing, and I won't say echoing, but making the point that all of us who see these other houses built know that if they were limited to a smaller size, they could have been put back behind the 100 setback line. And maybe the planning board doesn't want to look at those and consider them precedential, but there's no way for anybody to argue that the ordinance is being enforced in a discriminatory and arbitrary way if we can't do that. Now, if this is going back to the planning board for further consideration of their proposal and perhaps modification of it, that will give them an opportunity to put in the record these documents that came before the appeals board, which make it clear that there are a number of circumstances which on their face indicate that those structures could have been moved back further behind the 100-foot line if they were made smaller, but they weren't required to be made smaller. And so there is a basic issue of fairness, and my final comment, with your permission, is that the town of Reedfield has everything to gain by granting the Marash petition and nothing to lose. You're going to get better protection of the lake, elimination of an old house close to the lake and a septic system. They're going to get additional tax revenue. They're going to get great people moving into the neighborhood as full-time residents. Turning it down, you're going to probably force the residents, and I can't speak for them, the Marashas, to decide if they can't build a house that truly meets their needs on their current lot. What's their choice? Sell it, okay, fine. And then you're going to have the old house sitting there for an indefinite future with an old septic system threatening the lake. It is clearly in the interest of the town to grant this petition, to allow them to move the old structure back and to have a house that meets their needs for full-time residency. I just encourage some way, whether it goes back to the planning board or other way to do it. So let's get practical, as people have said, let's get on with this. Let's recognize that Marashas have legitimate needs. There are many merits to their proposal in terms of the lake and its protection, and it's good for the town overall. So we got to find a solution to this that is fair to them and certainly consistent under the old ordinance, which is what they're under and everybody agreed they're under. So we got to keep looking at that and say, to the greatest extent practical, are they meeting the requirements of that ordinance? And if not, then can they make some exceptions, as they've tried to do here, to meet that condition that exceptions can be allowed. Thank you for hearing me.
Anybody else on Zoom? Anybody else in the room? Go ahead.
Yeah, Eric Falconer, 152 Thorpe Shores Road. I live on the lake as well. I believe the planning board failed in a few ways. Number one, I believe that they did not keep a good record of this whole process. So it's kind of tough to go back and talk about what was said, what wasn't said throughout the process. And since it's the governmental board's authority and requirement to keep those records, I think lack of those records have to be swayed in the favor of the appellants. Number two, it's interesting that tonight the planning board is saying, hey, we talked to the town attorney, past decisions are not precedential. Many of us have been to all of these meetings, and over again, the whole time, the planning board was saying that they couldn't improve the Morash plan due to fear of setting a new precedent and its effect on future decisions, even though they were the last ones to apply under the 2020 ordinance. Also, over and over again, the planning board kept trying to apply the 2021 rules to them, even though they applied under the old rule. So I think that they failed in multiple ways there. Also, it's interesting tonight to hear Paula Clark state that really what needs to go into greatest practical extent, this sort of ambiguous clause, there are things like slope and old growth trees. Those are things that are to be factored in, which is exactly the argument that the Morashes have made right from the get-go. So, and again, going with the 14th Amendment of guarantees all citizens equal protection under the law, I believe that the planning board erred in their decision, and I encourage this board to overturn that decision.
Anybody else? Anybody want to move to declare the hearing closed and we go to deliberation?
Anything further that the
Oh, that's
applicant wants to say?
Yes, yes. Mr. Moran.
Give me a minute, please.
Sure.
Sorry.
I'd like to just say, from the start, we tried to formulate this whole project based on interpretation of the law. Looked at other situations that have occurred, thinking, okay, this is in the right, this is how, we should approach it. And we were very careful about doing that. And I feel like many of our meetings that we went through, they kept saying, okay, you need to do this. Then you need to do this. Then you need to do this. And I felt like we really tried to uphold every one of those until this last meeting when, we got the denial. We're not trying to do the wrong thing here. We just want to be here and retire and be happy in this community. And we just like you to consider our situation and what we've been up against.
And I will add, we're looking for uniformity in a standard that the planning board in the town of Reedfield has granted in the same vein to other structures and people on this lake, and approve those applications in 2 meetings time, and didn't go into any part of the depth that we have been dragged through for 2 years. In 2 meetings. With no meeting minutes required, no site visits. Building at 50 feet from the water. In 2020, thank you.
Anything else from the applicants? Mr. and Mrs. Marash? Anything else?
We're good, thank you.
Okay. Board members, any questions for the applicants?
Can you are you willing to keep this going another step? for planning board approval, depending on where we end up here?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Is this the end game, or is there a future step to be taken?
Depend on the motion. I think that's an unfair question to ask him without the rest of the information.
Okay.
I mean, maybe we could ask him that after we had some conversation.
Okay.
I think it's unfair.
Maybe
to
it's
ask
time
him.
to-
Yeah, go ahead.
No.
I think we could have some deliberation and then
do that.
maybe something like that, but I think it's unfair to have them like that, you know, are they gonna go further if we don't do something now? Okay. If I would, could you work in a lot of sales operation?
Anything else for the applicants, board members?
Motion to close the hearing.
I don't know if we need a motion, but the chair decides.
Well, I'll second your motion. Anybody in favor?
What was the motion?
In the hearing and go to deliberation?
Oh.
So can we vote? Are we okay with ending the hearing and going forward with deliberations? Vote of yes, raise your hand. All right, it's unanimous. Did everybody raise their hand? Henry, did you?
I did.
Okay, yes, it's unanimous. Okay, so the hearing is now closed. People on Zoom and in the room, please remain silent while we deliberate, unless we ask you a question. So, go ahead, Sean.
So I have a couple of questions because it's very complicated to understand all of this. In the event that they go back to the planning board and they submit what they'd like to do, would they be submitting under the ordinance that they originally applied under, which is the 2020 ordinance? Or would it be changed to be the new 2021 updated ordinance?
Well, I think the planning board might have the final say on that.
Okay.
My opinion, if you want my opinion, as a lawyer, it's that if a different application were where it's slightly different house, any kind of difference would go into the new ordinance, which, by the way, is not that very different.
Okay.
The greatest practical extent language is still there. There is a reinterpretation of what 1,500 square feet relates to. Conversely, the new ordinance, though, gives people relief from water body setbacks, such as the road. So it's a mixed bag.
I'd just like to recall what Will said about I believe the notice of decision, factual findings, there are 5 of them. I think the first 3 are the most important ones. I can't find fault with those factual findings. And so I don't fault the planning board in that. I do think that this territory of maximal practical extent is troubling to me. And I think there's some room to discuss, to work around that. I think the 14th Amendment idea of equal application of the law to all people should be advised. And I think a consideration of whatever the phrase is, I'm sorry, the existing practical extent or greatest practical extent. It's a 2-way street. There's not just a 1-way street, and you don't have 100-year-old white pines there, so it's not sort of an important ecological zone. But there's practical for the people who reside there, and there's practical for the people who are trying to protect the environment and apply the land use ordinance. And so I think that idea of practical extent needs to be taken under consideration. Again, I don't fault the planning board. I admire the planning board. I respect them. I think the work they've done is difficult, complicated, controversial, and frankly, not much fun. That said, I do think the squishy area of this greatest practical extent needs to be revisited. And I think it needs to be revisited with an eye towards a 2-way street that the practical extent for the applicant is to be considered as well as in the reading of the LUO. And I have that beyond my comments for the record. That's the issue I have in this trouble.
I get that, Henry, but I would say that's a statement for another day.
Okay,
The ordinance we have is, it's decided to the greatest practical extent as determined by the planning board. So I mean, the ordinance is saying we're putting a lot of faith in our planning board. Those guys, they see this stuff day in, day out.
okay, but Will, that's good. And that's why we're here as a Board of Appeals, because what we're saying, and perhaps remanding that decision or that opinion of the planning board, remanding that back to them, we're saying, we think, yes, you've done great work. We agree with your findings, except we think that the notion of greatest practical extent needs to be considered as a two-way street. And I disagree in the way they've applied that metric.
But you
to
said
that.
you thought that they could put the current house above the 100-foot line as it is.
Well, I think, no, but I also think that the planning board and the land use ordinance could be flexible to the point where whatever it is, it's on your plans. Some of the ones are between 75 and 100 feet and 75 feet. And that would meet the greatest practical extent test for the Marashes. And I think that is the two-way street that needs to be considered.
I think you're missing a step though. If you can get the current house as it is, take the little outline on this Dirigo survey map, take the little outline of the existing house. And if you can get it above the 100-foot line, which it, just from my naked
Well,
eye.
then it would be within the
clearly-
80-foot setback of the line provisions. And I'm not sure which is the garage or the driveway there, but there's some steep slopes on those topo lines that you'd have to go up to practically live in that area with the house moved up those, what is it?
But in this
15 or 20
case-
feet.
Yes.
That's what I read. And look, I go out and I shovel my sidewalk in the wintertime, and I don't sprinkle salt, but I occasionally put my ice creepers on. The winters aren't getting any easier around here, and to a practical extent to which I can continue to live on Giles Road in Reedfield, I'm gonna have my creepers handy, and there's gonna be ice, and you just we have to be practical about this. We have to figure out the environment in which we live and what we're asking ourselves and our neighbors to do as we traipse around our properties.
So do you think, as you remember visiting that lot, and looking at the slope, do you think that if the house was beginning at 75 feet from the water instead of 100, that would change? That
I'm
the
looking at
slope
the sketch map here where the deck and a portion of the inside of the house is within the 100-foot line. If you move all of the deck up above the 100-foot line, you have the three-way L or whatever the jags of the footprint crossing the 60-foot offset of the road. But that's not so much the issue because you can excavate that. You
Again,
can
I
change the site.
gotta back you up though. You're not looking at the new house, you're looking at the existing house. Can you put
Oh,
the
you can totally move the existing house within 100 feet of the line.
So when you say that, the analysis is done. That's it. Because now it's not a non-conforming structure, it's conforming. So now if you add to it, shrink it, stretch it out, whatever you do, it's gotta be conforming, so it can't get under the 100-foot line. So when you take the existing house and
Okay,
you
well,
get it up,
That's why I agree with the planning board's findings. I don't think that the test of greatest practical extent has been well addressed or well met or treated as a two-way street for the LUO and the applicant.
okay, I get your point.
And I also see here Henry's point. And I'm also somewhat troubled by being forced to make a decision based on all this information that we haven't had a chance to see. You know, we're reviewing their planning board. I feel a little bit uncomfortable from the standpoint that this situation where there's no precedence for all the other homes that were built. I find that a hard thing for me to understand, but I'm not allowed to take that into account.
And that's for good reason, because that would require us to literally relitigate every one of these houses. You want to do one of these hearings for all 8 or 10?
No,
We
no, I'm
can't-
just,
there's
but I
no
just
way.
say that I'm troubled with statements that what all of those other homes that were done has nothing to do with this house. And the process that all those other people went through is the same process that they went through.
So devil's advocate, the argument back to you
Sure.
is each piece of land has its own unique characteristics.
Right.
And we are volunteer bodies.
Right.
So if the planning board got it wrong once, are we really gonna expect them to get it wrong for forever now?
No, I guess what I'm saying is like, say for instance, and I'll ask the question because I'm not sure. If they go back to the planning board and they present their information in the planning board, and this other information is now part of the record, and then they wind up coming back here, we could then take this record into account that they had submitted.
Well, I have to say, John, I don't think so. And the reason is not because of what I personally would want, it's because of what the law is.
Okay.
We can't second, every lot is different. So they may judge, the planning board made judgment calls based on somewhat subjective criteria, that's right. And we're under the ordinance, we're not supposed to substitute our judgment for theirs. So even if they got it wrong in these other cases, even if we believe they got it wrong, we can't therefore say, well, they have to give relief to this applicant unless they misinterpreted the ordinance. I think that's our job to clear whether they misinterpreted, the planning board somehow misinterpreted the ordinance. Because the basic facts, I think, are undisputed. You know, about where the existing house is, that it, how big it is, where it could be moved beyond 100 feet, the existing house. And according to the planning board's decision, it then, if it were moved, I mean, the new house, the replacement house could be larger than 2,100 square feet, obviously it could be. What the planning board seems to be saying though is the proposal in front of them, which is not entirely outside of 100 feet, that doesn't meet the ordinance. And I think, so the only issue for us is whether that's a mistake of law that they made in saying that. Not what I think personally might be doable. By the way, you would think though, that in a system that's less legalistic, we could have a more collaborative process in which a planning board could say to an applicant, this is what we would find acceptable. This is how big we think you could build it in this area without getting into a violation of our view of the ordinance. And then the applicant could either accept that or appeal it. You would think unfortunately, our process tends to be legalistic and not collaborative. And our job, unfortunately, as the appeals board is very legalistic.
I share Peter's concerns from earlier about it feeling a little bit like this doesn't really belong to the appeals court right now. It seems to me that that's the way the process has worked, and we're here and we're having this conversation. But really, I think these issues should have been hammered out at the planning board level. And it doesn't really feel like it's right for appeal right now. We're trying to listen and pay attention to your concerns. I also feel as a Board of Appeals member that my hands are a little bit tied simply because of the difference between appellate and de novo information that we are allowed to say. So we're only allowed to look at the appeals stuff that is on the record. There's no new information we can consider. And I think from that perspective, from the factual findings, I think our hands are a little bit tied. But I do think there's a conversation that should even be had still with the planning board.
I can say it has been my experience being involved in, the waterfront, executive director of the Friends of Copsey Watershed, phosphorus runoff, all the different issues about slope, 319 grants, milfoil removal, trying to do everything we can to protect the lakes. I also have a great deal of experience with what is done and what I have seen done in many different towns. And I do see many differences in the ways that different towns have approved projects around the water. So there is a, there is a large body of difference between what some people are able to accomplish around the water and others. So I do find that sometimes it is very hard to really understand, or some of it passing the straight face test with some of the stuff that's done around the water. And it goes very quick. It's done very quickly. It certainly doesn't seem to be done, in this, I don't know how many meetings or how many events that you've been through and how much you. So I find that, and I know from looking at, from a real estate perspective, myself, looking at properties, and I look at it and I say, geez, that would be nice to buy that. But it's all trees there, so you'd only have a 6-foot canopy. And the next thing, someone else buys it and all the trees are gone. And I'm shocked of how some of that could take place. So I just think that we're bound by a certain marching orders that we have that we can take a look at. But I think that they would be able to go back to the planning board and have another discussion, take some of the information into account, and perhaps maybe they can work out some type of way that they can take a compromise where something like this can move forward so that it's successful for all people. I can tell you my personal experience as a car dealer. I wanted to build, well, I should say, my father wanted to build a storage garage to put his cars in, his personal cars. I think it was going to be 60 by 50. We had acres and acres of land, plenty of land to be able to do it. They said that we would have to close off the entrances and that we wouldn't be able to do it unless we close off the entrance and planted trees, because we were not a permitted use. Car dealers were not a permitted use. We were a special exception use. Other car dealers had done many different things, including building buildings without permits. Different people have done all sorts of different things. I had to plant trees, but nobody else did, so to speak. In that particular situation, we got the car dealers together. We went to the city council. We became a permitted use, and some of that stuff was taken care of. But
That was Augusta?
Yeah, that was Augusta.
Not Reedfield.
It was Augusta, the city of Augusta. But the application of the rules in different ways, and the way that some were able to do it and some were not able to do it. I just think that, I don't see myself as a reasonable person seeing that these other structures being handled in a certain way would give me the impression as an applicant, not as an appeals board member, that perhaps similar considerations would be forthcoming. So I think that although I have to vote based upon the duties that I'm charged with, my recommendation would be that the applicant would go back to the planning board. And I respect all the situation of everybody in the planning board, and I understand how hard it is to make these decisions, but by the same token, the whole issue of it being somewhat with a fair application of standards throughout the same type of period. I think some of the things that they had mentioned is it's during a similar time that these other projects move forward without the same kind of oversight and stipulations.
And so arguments like it's great for the lake, we could bend the regulations, Reedfield has everything to gain. It's been a difficult, long process. There should be uniformity in the process.
I didn't say anything.
Not you, but I'm just throwing those out there. Those are all arguments that would be great if we had de novo powers, but we don't.
Right.
We don't. So our issues are, we look at the facts and it's essentially, can we move that original structure above 100 foot? And if you answer yes to that, and then it's the question Peter is saying, is that a correct application of the law? Or does that mean that you have to build everything above the 100 foot mark once you can get that original structure above the 100 foot mark? Right.
I'd like to comment on finding of fact number 3, which is the one that has to do with stating that the existing 2,100 square foot structure could be reconstructed. with the house that's proposed, when you subtract the lot area comprising the 100-foot setback, 50-foot road setback, 20-foot boundary setbacks, there does not appear to be enough remaining land area to build the desired footprint without encroaching on one of the setbacks. The July 2020 LUO does not provide a mechanism for setback or road reductions short of a variance. And we've been through the variance, it doesn't work. It's long been a concern that the size of the structure in the shoreline zone beyond the 100-foot setback is largely unlimited, provided that the project does not exceed 20% impervious area or 10,000 feet in opening area. Although the planning board recognized that a significant expansion could be built beyond the 100-foot setback to render it fully conforming, there's no requirement imposing a maximum size limitation, nor did the planning board attempt to establish one. So the question in hand, I think, is whether up to 1,500 feet is allowed within the 75 to 100-foot setback. Section 4B1B, July 2020 ordinance states that relocated non-conforming structures may be expanded or altered to include an expansion of up to 1,500 square feet if the expansion does not result in an increase in non-conformity. It does not.
What was the number again, Cliff?
For the 1,500 square
Did you
feet,
say 1B, 4B?
section 4B1, subsection B. It's the one that states that non-conforming structures may be expanded.
But that's only relevant once you get that little existing house over the 100-foot and it's there, then it's conforming. It's no longer non-conforming. So that
Well-
doesn't apply.
Well, the planning board in its notice of decision did not cite a reference in the July 2020 ordinance as to why the new conforming portion of the structure must be downsized to become fully conforming. So in the presence of maybe expanded language, and in the absence of any must be conforming, the scale tips, I think, to the may be expanded side.
You don't get to maybe expanded until if you try and move the existing structure over 100-foot and you put it up there, and you're like, it doesn't fit. A little piece of it sticking up below the 100. Then you get to play with the 1,500 feet and you get it to expand under a non-conforming. But once you take that original structure and you can put it up above the 100-foot, you're done.
There's
Well, I see
no,
that
there's no,
phrase. Oh, I'm sorry.
there's no requirement in the ordinance as to what can be built beyond the 100-foot setback.
Exactly. You can
can
do whatever
build
you
a
want,
You can build a Taj Mahal back there
right?
if you meet all the standards.
Absolutely.
And it says it may be expanded into the 75 to 100.
Maybe we're talking about the same thing then. So if you can push it up above 100, then it's conforming structure, right? It's
Right.
conforming. Then you can make it as big as you want, as long as you stay above 100. Once you come below 100, you're non-conforming, and you don't get to do that. You don't get to come back once you've gone above. That's how I understand
I
it.
mean, what we're trying to do, or what the planning board's trying to do is regulate the size of the house you can build beyond 100 feet.
No,
No, I don't agree.
no.
I don't agree.
If you've got say they had 10 acres behind that 100-foot line, you could build the Taj Mahal. But
Except for the height
unfortunately,
restriction.
right. We're being loose with the terms there, but.
I don't see anything in the ordinance precludes them from
So it's
building the house they want as long as they don't exceed 1,500 feet.
it's Article 7, Section 5, in the table of uses, it says, for a single residency house, you gotta be 100 feet away from the lake.
For a new structure, we're talking about a reconstruction.
Well, we're talking about a relocation of a non-conforming, and if you take your non-conforming and you can relocate it above the 100, what happens? It loses its non-conforming status. It's conforming now. So then Article 7, Section 5 applies.
This is not a new structure. This falls under reconstruction or replacement paragraphs.
Reconstruction or replacement of a non-conforming structure.
Right.
But once you can put it above the 100 foot,
So, Bill, this is what I'm struggling with.
Yeah.
You keep saying that,
yeah,
and I understand why, and I've looked at the sketches that show the yellow colored existing structure and the gray colored outline, that's the new structure, and you've got the 75 foot and 100 foot, and certainly that yellow box looks like it can fit above 100 feet. Okay, that's
Right,
fine.
right.
And the document that sort of, at least in my mind, has been governing this conversation is the email that we received, I think, was it yesterday? And it's to the Board of Appeals from the chair and vice chair of the planning board. I believe sort of providing some of the legal underpinnings for the decision of the planning board in this matter is both important to the deliberations of the Board of Appeals and determinative of the decision on this matter. I don't disagree with that, except I'm wondering if in fact this memo, which seems to be very informative of that notion of taking that yellow footprint and moving it up above 100 feet, I'm not sure that's part of the official record of the planning board.
Exactly.
It's state law, though.
It was stated
It's state
yesterday.
law, we have to, we're sort of
Wasn't in the
required,
decision.
we're required to comply with state law, whether or not the
I'm with you.
decision
Yes.
mistakenly or for some reason didn't discuss it. I mean, it is state law. If it's, unless it's a miscitation to the law,
The state law only has to do with requiring Department of Environmental Protection to write guidelines. That's what the law says.
Should we pause while he's out of the room? Should we take a 3-minute break? Till he returns?
Can we just stay here till he returns?
Yeah, no, but yeah, in other words, but.
I mean, we're at 8:08 already.
Well, okay, so if reconstructed a replacement structure.
Hang on, Henry, we're just gonna wait till he comes back.
well, we're Article 7, Section 5, just for the purpose of the record. That's where it says 100 feet.
That's fine. The cliff says that's a new structure.
Yeah.
I'm just pulling numbers. out of
Right.
everywhere.
There's a little bit of difference between new and reconstruction and
Okay.
replacement.
Mhm.
It's a reconstruction, and a little more permissive. It does cite.
Well, what it cites to is, it's, section 4B, 4B1. That's what it cites to, and it gives the planning board a lot of discretion in that respect, as terms of what's permissible relocation. Provided that the site of relocation conforms to all setback requirements to the greatest practical extent as determined by the planning board. Not by me.
Which brings up comments for the finding of fact number 4. I think it's the mountain type of vegetation be removed, criteria. There was a lot of discussion about erosion, stormwater control in the planning board minutes and at the site visits. And the DEP, Cobbossee Watershed District, the others, the applicants. And the findings of fact and the notice of decision did not seem to specifically address removal of vegetation to the extent that it was raised. Now, I noticed from the record that the planning board conducted their site visit in early May prior to the emergence of any vegetation. The Board of Appeals conducted their site visit the very end of October, after all the vegetation was removed. I took a drive out there last week, a drive by, take a look at it in full vegetation. And it struck me that that area beyond 100 feet is really a full canopy of hardwoods and softwoods both, and provides a fantastic cover for stormwater. And to open that up to the footprint they're proposing, not only is going to destroy that, but I have a feeling it's going to exceed the 10,000 square feet, is why I brought that up. Not going to work. Find that I just think that the vegetation issue is a big one, if you can go out and look at it in summertime under full vegetation.
But that's not, we can't do that.
But the
The
ordinance.
planning
only-
board, that's the planning board's job. I
Right,
think a factual determination of what was feasible.
right. I don't know if you
They
can
may
call
be
it.
wrong.
When did they make it? Come on.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'm
It's-
sorry. I'm sorry.
It's, you can argue with them. That's not but it's not the job of the appeals board to say to the planning board, you made the wrong call on what's feasible. That's not what the law permits us to do.
I wouldn't call it necessarily an error of law.
No, it's an error of fact, which we're not permitted to get into, if
Yeah,
it's
we did.
anything.
I agree with you.
Because-
We can't second guess the facts. Or we can't relitigate it.
The ordinance requires them to consider it.
Right.
Well,
I guess they don't have to consider it all,
they don't
No,
have
they
to.
did. They just didn't
But-
come to your conclusion.
but
Well,
it's an omission
It's
more than-
broaching absurdity here. You spend a lot of time and burn a lot of calories thinking about it, and it feels a little absurd, frankly.
But I guess my main point is board has always recognized the fact that once you hit the 100 feet, you're free to do what you want to do.
But you can't come
That's-
back under the
That's
100 feet,
That's a
right?
flaw, right?
You can't come back into the 100 feet once you go above it, right?
Well, the ordinance says may be,
That's if it's a non-conforming
may be
structure.
expanded.
If it's a non-conforming structure. So once it's above 100, it's no longer non-conforming.
But
What is
because
section 12
the
C1
limitations of the setbacks don't allow it to be above 100 for the desired structure.
Not desired, existing. We don't get to desired. This decision doesn't get to desired.
There's nothing in there that says anything about the existing structure that you have to
Sure
mimic
it
the same
does.
size.
Sure it does, under reconstruction and replacement.
It says here, if the reconstructed or replacement structure is less than the required setback, it shall not be any larger than the original structure. That's what you keep saying, Will. You can move the existing structure to past the 100-foot setback and
Right.
keep it within all the other required
Yes.
setbacks. Except, it says, as allowed pursuant to section 12C1 above, and that is what I'm looking for, I can't find.
Is everybody looking at the July 2020 language?
I have been, but I'm now reading the memo.
Yeah, so that's,
Citing that.
that's the state regulation.
That's the state regulation, which we cannot enforce because it's only guidelines. We have to adopt them first.
It's a rule. It's not a guideline.
We're not permitted. You know, that subject comes up over and over again. You get to enforce guidelines. It's our obligation to adopt them.
No, I don't know if that state rule should, the planning board did not rely on that state rule in its decision. So whether you call it, even if you say it's not really a rule, it's the guideline, I think it still goes back to the planning board making a judgment call that the house could be built beyond the 100-foot. A larger house than the original could be built. And that, but that the house proposed to be built didn't comply with ordinance to the greatest practical extent with it, because it's still within 100 feet and maybe for other reasons, I don't know.
Well, you could shrink the design of the house as currently proposed and somehow keep it within that 100-foot setback. But it would not, to a practical extent, meet the needs of the Morash.
Well, it wouldn't have a deck. I mean, it wouldn't have a deck that goes to the west. I'm sorry, the east. But I think if you, I'm not saying you should do that, take out the deck, but if you did,
It's beyond the deck, it's more than the deck.
It's-
Yes, it's part of the inside living area. Yes.
I wish we could pull up the design we spent huge dollars putting together.
Mr.
Why
Marash.
can't we bring that up?
Mr. Rash, at this point, we're still in deliberation.
I move that deliberations end.
a second,
All right, all in favor, raise your hand.
I wanted to ask a question. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I'm peeking over here.
Yeah.
If, as it looks, you guys are gonna vote that uphold the planning board, what options do the Marashes have to go forward again? Are they stuck?
no, well, they can appeal to court from, if, and I'm not presupposing, if our decision is that the planning board didn't make an error of law, and we're therefore deny the appeal. If we did that, they could appeal that to Superior Court. Or they could go back to the planning board with a different proposal.
And they had an application for a variance before us before, which we didn't consider because.
No, we
planning board-
considered it.
Well, we
did
didn't,
consider it.
we didn't allow it or whatever
Yeah.
because of they hadn't been fully through the planning board yet. Can they go and ask for a variance on the 100-foot setback? Can they come back to us and say,
Not on that.
can they come back and apply for another variance? How does that work?
They can always apply for a variance.
But that would be from the road,
from the road,
the frontage,
property line.
yeah.
They can't ask for a variance.
I don't
on
believe,
water-
it. No,
I don't
not
think
from a
that's-
water body, not from a great pond.
Water body, there's no variance on that, okay. All right.
But yeah, they can go back to the planning board, they can submit a variance application, that's as well. Anything else? Planning board members?
Continue on. Go ahead. I'm looking at the
So we're
paragraph.
back in deliberation.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
okay.
take the vote.
All right. That's all right.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. No, no. I just trying to keep track of where we are, that's all.
Cliff, anything else?
On paragraph B, relocation. It talks about non-conforming structures being relocated within the boundaries of the parcel. And that it may be relocated provided that the site conforms to all setback requirements to the greatest practical extent. And then you go into subsection B. Provided any expansions to the relocated structure do not exceed the expansion limitations set forth in Article 3, Section 4A1, or the size of this,
Whichever is greater.
whichever is greater.
And for it, we're talking about the 1,500 square foot deal. That's what that refers to, I believe.
Oh, wait a minute. Where are you getting that number, Peter?
Because it references Article 3, Section 4A1, and
It says any expansion to the relocated structure do not exceed the expansion limitations.
yeah, how does that help? How does that get us out of the?
It allows expansions, in this case, considering the size of the lot to take place within the 75 to 100.
That's,
It's the size of the original structure or the size of the original structure, whichever is greater. And clearly the gray is greater than the yellow on that sketch map. You see.
but you're not reading the statute correctly, which says, first, it says and provided. First, the planning board has to decide that the relocation conforms to all setback requirements to the greatest practical extent. And then it also has to come within those limitations in Article 3, Section 4A1. It's not either or.
All right, so. I think, so the factual findings, number 3, I don't disagree with it as far as it goes, but I think the decision was based on a limited reading of the LUO, where we were just examining it. And it said, or, or whichever is greater, phrase. So, I initially said I don't take issue with the finding of facts, but I think on 3, I'm not sure it's complete finding of facts. Especially as I'm not an expert in the LUO, but I think Cliff and our CEO are. Between new and replacement structures is subtle but important.
So if there's any error, it would be in their consideration of taxes. So for the land, vegetation removal, is the greatest practical extent standards.
That's design.
That's where the
And
error.
we can't second guess that. For finding the fact. The applicant said it was 5%, 17% or whatever too steep. The planning board said, oh, slope is fine. You can push the house back.
I think that's too limited, Will.
Well, it's but our job. It's what our job is.
No, I'm not getting into the little territory in that comment. I don't believe. I'm still on the appellate footing. Our job is to agree or disagree with these findings of fact.
No,
And
actually,
I can agree with 1, I can agree with 2. On 3, I mostly agree with it, but I don't think it goes far. And I think that's a legitimate place to take issue.
So again, whether you're under 4B, section 4B under relocation, or section 4C under reconstruction and replacement,
Yeah.
or under 4A expansion, those are all dealing with non-conforming structures. So once we take that existing little footprint and we put it over 100 feet,
That's too convenient, Will. I just think it's too convenient.
and that matches the highlighted state regulation that we got yesterday from the planning board. That interpretation matches that highlighted state reg, saying you
That's-
can't,
That state reg is not in here.
it
Right.
is with our non-conforming. All of section 4 is about
It's not provided
non-conforming
with the-
structures. And once we can move that existing structure, non-conforming structure into conformity, section 4 doesn't apply anymore.
Okay, so here's where I'm heading, at least in my thinking, and I'll put this to my colleagues on the Board of Appeals to consider. I don't take issue with 1. The existing home contains approximately 2,100 square feet of floor area. I think we're all in agreement about that. Number 2, the existing structure is located starting at approximately 14 feet from the normal high water line. We've got aerial photographs. We've been on the site. We acknowledge that. Number 3, I think is mostly correct, but I don't think it goes far enough. And so the idea, and I'm not sure whether we're able to do this or not, but is to remand this issue back to the planning board for consideration and collaborative conversation with the appellant here around 3, around the notion of greatest practical extent, around the issue of whichever is greater language, reconcile the whole issue of LUO 2020 with the guidelines that are not yet law, and have that conversation on the table and talk to them about that. Because otherwise, it seems to me that I've spent 2.5 hours here, and it's been interesting and kind of fun, but it's not really all that productive, and it's a silly process that the town of Reedfield allows itself to go through for people who are trying to do the right thing. That puts me in the difficult zone, but that's my opinion.
I think that's just appellate review. Almost any appellate review seems kind of senseless, because we don't get a fresh bite at the apple.
Well, then I might resign from the Board of Appeals and come back when it's a de novo.
Or we could change the land use or the Board of Appeal ordinance, But I think we got to deal with the ordinance that's in front of us.
I'm afraid we do.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong, there's distaste in my mouth too.
Will, I think there's validity in the points I'm making, and that we've heard from the appellants, and there's validity in the points that the planning board has made.
So what would you want the third finding of fact to say? You said it was incomplete. What would you add to it?
A similarly sized structure, when the LUO talks about whichever is greater language. I don't think they're blocked into a similarly sized structure.
What
And I
language are you
don't- I
looking
don't-
at? In the ordinance that's saying that?
We were just at it, 4B, I think.
Top of page 9 on that 2020 ordinance. B.
And please don't hear me to be argumentative within the zoning board of appeals, but I have pretty strong opinions about at least the process that's behind this, and I care that people get treated fairly.
Could be that the greatest practical extent standards need to be revisited. Taking a fresh look at the site. Quite an eye opener. And I think it would behoove the applicant to perhaps take some cleared opening measurements, see if it's even possible to clear out the area without exceeding 10,000 square feet of cleared opening.
That would be a great argument if we had de novo powers here.
It's too bad because I'm not a lawyer and I don't really, I can aspire to be a lawyer. But the limitations of the legal profession in this are so cut and dried and so limiting, they don't allow for these, I think, important considerations to be brought forward.
Well, by the way, under state law, boards of, each town can decide whether the Board of Appeal has de novo jurisdiction over its planning board decisions.
And Reedfield chose to be appellate.
Yeah, against my advice, I said we should have de novo authority because, for a variety of reasons, and I was outvoted,
Right.
I move that deliberation cease.
I second
John,
the
you're
end.
not persistent.
All in favor, raise your hand. All right, unanimous.
Can I say something? This is Jack.
No, we're done with, no. We're going on to a motion from the board. Only the board should speak at this point. I'll make a motion. That based on the limited standard of appellate review available to us, the Board of Appeals finds that there was no clear error of law in the planning board decision and therefore must deny the appeal.
I second the motion. All in favor?
No, we need discussion.
Oh, discussion, go ahead.
I think there's got to be a codicil to that motion with some advisement to perhaps the town, perhaps the planning board, perhaps to ourselves, to become a de novo appellate board. make that, or something in the record to that effect. I don't think, I think this is broaching on absurdity for us to have 2.5 hours of these kinds of proceedings.
I think that's preserved on the record here. I mean, we're recording this. We've been talking about that for probably the last half hour. I think that's preserved for anyone who wants to, who's been here or wants to listen to this record. But it's not really proper for the final motion. I think.
Proper?
Yeah. I mean, it's an up or down. We're
Well,
here
he
to decide.
can modify the motion.
You can make a separate motion and ask for that.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, because it's already been
There's a
first and second.
No.
So is there deliberation or not?
Yeah, so yeah, maybe its own motion. It would be better for that. Or it could be, we could meld them together. I don't know. Those are just my thoughts.
Well, we have a motion and a second right now. And is there deliberation?
Yeah, we're deliberating. Any more deliberation?
Well, so there are 5 factual findings, and I think we have to capture all 5, do we not, in our motion?
Well, the last one says it's really not a determination in the actual.
Then I think we should enumerate which factual findings we're agreeing with and basing potentially denial and appeal. 1, 2, and 3 are the ones that I'm hearing most loudly. Number 4. That is kind of where we get into the greatest practical extent gray area, because it talks about slope of land, significant limitation on the applicant's ability to build an enlargement to the constructed home that would meet all setback requirements. We know we can meet setback requirements. All you have to do is shrink the size of the footprint of the new structure, which we really don't want to do. And that's where I struggle with the two-way street element of greatest practical extent. So, and that's a very concise planning board factual finding. Number 4 is, but it leaves out the nuance of the greatest practical extent considerations. We spent a lot of time talking. So I'm good with 1 and 2. I'm mostly good with 3, and 4 is where I'm seeing gray area, and that's sort of in discussing the motion that was seconded. I'm offering my opinion of why, if I vote no against the motion, I would base it on those comments and ask others to consider the same.
You want to limit your motion to just the first 3 findings?
I think under Article 6B or Section 6B of our Board of Appeals ordinance, we don't have to get into that level of particularity.
Gotcha.
Because we're not supposed to substitute our judgment for that of the planning board on any questions of fact.
But the facts are written in English language that is either complete or incomplete.
We're not agreeing with their facts. We don't have to. All we have to figure out is whether they get a mistake of law and how they look at how they interpret the ordinance.
Okay, point taken, Peter. Thank you.
That's just my argument.
Yep, it's a good one.
Any other deliberation?
I agree with Henry. I think this, I find this all very frustrating. It doesn't seem to me like the planning board considered all the factors that they could have, but I'm not a lawyer, so kind of hamstrung.
Seems to me that a new site visit and revisit the greatest practical extent standards is being ordered. The trouble is, it drags the applicant through a longer process. But I don't think they addressed them very specifically in the finding of fact.
Yeah, the greatest practical extent,
Yes,
all those
I
factors.
think they all need to be elaborated on.
Do you want to remand it?
I would lean in that
I
direction.
would, that's kind of the direction I'm leaning, and
Punt it
we
back
have
to
to
them.
really dissect the greatest practical extent standards and.
Like, where does it go from 5% to 17%?
Right, I mean, 17%, if it was 3% more, it'd have been zone resource protection for steep slopes.
Yeah.
So 17% is pretty steep.
You remember being that steep?
I didn't take my econometer out.
I'm a forester. I've been over hundreds of thousands of acres of forest land, and I know what steep slope is, and I know that's been steep ground.
Okay. Yeah. Not that we can substitute our judgment for their facts.
We could remand it for more
We
thorough.
could, I guess
Please
that's in our
explain,
power.
please explain the remand aspect that you were both now talking about.
Peter, you take that.
Well, I don't think it's a course of action that we can pursue here.
You don't think it's an option?
No, not
Why
in this.
take that back then?
They had, they had scads of hearings. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a transcript. Because it's not required legally to have a transcript. We have a lot of minutes, though. I did read the minutes. I do think these issues were considered. Whether they were resolved correctly, I don't know. But it doesn't really matter what I believe, whether they were resolved correctly. No, under the ordinance, we can, it does say, that's our Board of Appeals ordinance. It says we can remand the matter to the planning board for additional fact finding. So if you think they need to make additional fact finding in order to decide whether there's a legal error or not, you can do it. Personally,
Well,
anyway.
what findings of additional facts are we interested in? Degree slope, percent slope?
Greatest practical extent, all of it, all of it.
Yeah. So I think we have a basis to remand with respect to the planning board. Who bled, sweated, and cried over this thing, and so have you guys. But I do think we have a basis for remanding respectfully back to the planning board on these matters.
Say they, I mean, just for argument's sake, say we did that and they do a big factual thing and they send us a big 10-page decision and say, we think the slope is fine. We looked at it and we think everything is fine. And we still, as a group, go, "Man, it's just crazy. We don't agree with that. We think they can build a house there." We still have appellate review at that point if it got appealed to us. And we still go, they did it again.
Yeah.
Can we remand it again? More facts. Give me a 20 pages of it next time.
Well,
I mean, we're disagreeing with their decision. And that's
appealing to the
not,
appeals board is absurd.
yeah, I agree. And it's appellate review.
That is.
All right, that's a lot of discussion. Any more discussion? What's our current motion that's pending?
That's the one I said where, based on our limited standard, and the secretary could read it back, but based on our limited standard of appellate review, we find that there's no clear error of law in the planning board's decision, and therefore we feel we must deny the appeal. That was my motion.
I'll second that motion.
So I would counter propose if the maker of the motion in Robert's rules is willing to change his motion to remanding based on the topics of discussion that's memorized in this very long discussion, that should be the motion instead.
No, we need a vote on this motion, then if it fails, then you can just propose your motion.
Do we have a Robert's Rules of Order?
It doesn't apply here. It really doesn't. We make our own rules.
Something should apply here.
Well, plenty does apply. I think we've exercised very good due process here, based on the limitations we work under. So I don't appreciate the criticism.
Yeah.
I agree. We've tried very hard to be very balanced and to investigate all issues here tonight. And anybody who hasn't been paying attention to that, there's been a lot of conversation that's been very helpful and informative.
Any more discussion on this motion? All voting for the motion, raise your hand.
Can we abstain?
Of course you can.
A vote for the motion is to deny the appeal.
Correct.
Okay.
So that's 3. All against? All right, 3-3. It's a tie.
Fran.
All right, so on that, the applicant loses, you gotta get a majority.
The motion fails.
The motion fails. And that was a motion on the decision. That's our decision.
Motion was to deny it, so
Deny the appeal.
that motion failed. Doesn't mean it's approved.
It was tied. It was tied, and
Right.
the applicant needs a majority to win.
But someone needs another motion, someone needs to make another.
I'll make the motion to remand the Board of Appeals decision to the planning board for further consideration based on greatest possible extent, based on factual elements of finding, measurable elements of finding on the ground relative to slope, distances, vegetation,
Building.
corner pins, et cetera.
Openings.
And that we, and not limited to those items that I just enumerated, but based on what we can dredge out of the record of this long discussion.
And does that also give the applicant an opportunity to present more information to the planning board?
Well, that'll be up to the planning board. You can't control what they do, there's a reason.
And we don't want to. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So my motion is to amend the application to the planning board for additional factual findings.
Is that under the 2020 ordinance?
I believe under the,
I would
under the 2020.
Under existing
think so.
ordinance
I
that we're-
mean, you can't change the rules. Okay,
Which one are you saying
the July 2020,
is the one that we should continue to?
yes.
But doesn't the 21 give them more flexibility or?
Well,
building envelope
They gave them the
size?
choice. I guess if they want to go to the 2021, they can take that up to the planning board.
So we're just remanding it to the. planning
Yes.
Yes.
Can I ask a
I'll
question?
second.
Can I ask a
Yeah.
question? Are you asking us to, are you asking the planning board to review the siting of a 2,100 square foot house, given greatest practical extent? Or are you asking us to review an application of a 4,600 square foot house, the greatest practical extent?
I think, well, my opinion is you got a pending application, so you'd still be reviewing it at the pending application, unless the applicant modifies its application.
I agree.
Can I say something, seeing as you get the planning board, you acknowledged him, I'd like to be acknowledged.
Yeah, go ahead.
We've never submitted a permit for 2,100 square feet, okay? We submitted, and we're told back in 2020, when we first submitted this, what a great job you've done submitting this application, and you've been very thorough with it, and thank you for supplying all this information to us. It was 4,600 square feet. We've never tried to build the 2,100 square foot. It would not meet our needs. And we did discuss, some aspect of mediation, understanding the new ordinance, which states that if Jack has a structure at 30 feet from the water and he moves back to 90 feet from the water, this is the example out of the 2021 land use regulation. He then therefore can build the structure back and have the reduction of half the reduction of that 60 foot that he has moved back away from the water in relaxation of other setbacks.
Mr. Morash, I've given you a little leeway, but I mean, we're just getting a question from the planning board and you're testifying. We're no longer receiving evidence at this point. And now on the motion to remand, it seems kind of pointless because our first motion, we have denied the application, the appeal in this case. The appellant's lost. And so their natural course that they want to build is just to go back to the planning board anyway. So we don't need to order them to go back there. They can just go. And then I don't have to write that.
So any other discussion on this motion to remand?
Well, it was moved and it was seconded by John,
Yeah,
and we're now discussing it, so Mr. Chair, call the vote or not. it's up to you.
any other discussion on this? All right, all for this motion to remand, raise your hand. 4, all against? 2, we are remanding. All right, so I gotta do a decision that's unfavorable. Can I meld them together?
Well, no, I think the motion didn't pass. The motion was a tie vote,
No, it was 4-2.
the first motion.
Oh, right.
So I think there's no decision on the first motion. There's no denial or grant of the appeal.
That's
There's
right.
simply a remand.
That's right.
That's the way I hear it.
We may just majority.
Yeah.
That's what you two lawyers get to work.
So what did you say before the remand vote? It was all set, but after the remand vote, it's not all set.
I guess so.
Okay, all right.
So it's like a 1-sentence decision to remand.
I move we adjourn.
I second.
All in favor, raise your hand.
Well, off the record, I want to say thank you.
Please.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
And thank you, everyone, for all their comments. It was very helpful.
Oh, it's
You're ready.
Well, I'm gonna have to, let it get discretion. Most of it helps.
Whatever you do, don't.
take your time
and a half, all right?
Well, I'll email it.
I know.